Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak, your podcast available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Monday, the 18th of November in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, the US authorises Ukraine's use of Western-made weapons to strike targets inside Russia.
Infighting grows as contenders tussle for support to be Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary.
Plus, dwindling support. Could Germany's Social Democrats replace Chancellor Scholz as their leader for the upcoming election?
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Joe Biden has given Ukraine the green light to use Western-made weapons to strike military targets inside Russia. It's understood that US thinking shifted on the issue after North Korean troops appeared on the battlefield. Assessments by some G20 countries suggest Pyongyang could eventually send Russia as many as 100,000 troops. In his Sunday evening address, Ukraine's President Zelensky said any strikes on Russia would not be telegraphed in advance.
Today, there's a lot of talk in the media about us receiving permission for respective actions. But strikes are not carried out with words. Such things are not announced. Missiles will speak for themselves.
Zelensky's words, spoken there by a translator, came after a massive Russian aerial attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Around 120 missiles and 90 drones were reportedly fired at the country. In response, Kyiv has powered down most of its operational nuclear reactors.
China's leader says the country is ready for a fight with America, though would rather be friends. Xi Jinping told outgoing President Joe Biden that China sees 4 red lines in its relationship with the US. Bloomberg's executive editor for Greater China, John Liu, explains those red lines are targeted at Trump.
One, that the U.S. should not seek to contest the Communist Party's grip on power in China, that the United States should not try to push China to become a democracy, that the United States should not try to contain China's economic rise. And lastly, and probably most importantly, that the United States should not support Taiwanese independence. And so it did seem President Xi, ahead of a new Trump administration, trying to put some guardrails, bumpers around where this relationship could go.
John Liu speaking there. Trump has threatened to hit Beijing with tariffs of 60% and tapped several hardliners on China to lead his foreign policy team.
The search for Donald Trump's chief economic policymaker has devolved into tussling over the weekend. The Treasury Secretary position includes overseeing the $28 trillion Treasuries market and economic sanctions. Sources say billionaire and close Trump confidant Elon Musk has now spoken to potential pick Scott Bessent after publicly endorsing a separate candidate, Howard Lutnick. Bessent declined to comment on the reports, while Musk did not immediately respond. Trump's staff have been also considering alternatives, including former US Trade Representative under Trump Robert Lighthizer, Apollo CEO Mark Rowan, former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh and Senator Bill Hagerty, according to those familiar with discussions. On Saturday, Trump picked Chris Wright, who runs a Colorado-based oil and gas fracking services company, to lead the US Energy Department.
Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz is facing dwindling support within his own party ahead of February's election. Bloomberg understands that some members of Schultz's Social Democrats would rather see Defence Minister Boris Pistorius as their leader. The party is set to pick a Chancellor candidate at a party conference in January. They are currently third in national polls.
The UK inflation data is expected to exceed its 2% target, which might support the Bank of England's slow approach to rate cuts. Economists forecast CPI will rise to 2.2%, half a percentage point higher than in October. Bloomberg's James Wilcock has more.
After 3 years of being well above its 2% inflation target, most experts think the Bank of England will only have 1 month beneath it. Higher energy costs are likely to drive a surge in prices in Wednesday's figures, but service inflation is expected to weaken as recent data suggests firms are raising wages but are struggling to pass on price increases. If the forecasters are right, it could firm up the central bank's slow but steady approach to rate cuts. In London, James Alcock, Bloomberg Radio.
And lastly, UK home sellers are offering their houses at a discount after the government upped taxes. Asking prices fell by 1.4% in November in the wake of Chancellor Rachel Reeves's budget. House prices often drop in the UK at this time of the year, but this is twice the normal fall. Rightmove collected the data. They put the move down to an increase to stamp duty charges.
Those are your top stories on the markets. After Friday's close, US equities had erased half of their post-election gains. The S&P 500 fell by 1.3%. The Nasdaq closed down 2.4%. And after the 10-year Treasury yield hit 4.5% on Friday, yields are starting the week at 4.43%. In Asia, commentary from the Bank of Japan governor failed to boost the yen, which is trading 0.1% weaker this morning against the dollar at 154.52.
Now, in a moment, we're going to discuss the war in Ukraine as Biden agrees to the use of long-range missiles against Russia. But first, another story that caught my eye. It's quite in the weeds, but it's very interesting about how economists are preparing for a second Trump presidency. The weekend may have been full of the names and the top picks for the Trump administration, but how are economists and analysts thinking about it? They're trying to plan in terms of the upheaval that we might see for trade, tax, immigration, and pretty much every other policy area you can think of. How are they doing that? Analysts are particularly focused on tariffs and their impact on the two largest economies in the world, the US and China. And so we've got tales of, for example, the head of global markets research at Nomura downloading Truth Social. UBS's analysts spending 5 months developing a global tariff model that's got all sorts of sort of variables included, depending on how the tariffs are then absorbed.
Well, I mean, fundamentally, this is a profession that, relies on constants and assumptions to be able to make forecasting models. And essentially what the economist that our colleague Katia Dimitrieva has been speaking to said is that they're having to sort of prepare for those assumptions to be upended, which means they have to be on top of both the latest information, but also have the team available who can start to crunch the data that if trade tariffs, for example, land here or there at whatever rate facing whatever country, that they will be quickly able to analyse what sort of effect that's going to have both on US economic growth, perhaps on Chinese economic growth if we're talking about measures targeting China. So it's essentially seeing these teams having to be an awful lot more dynamic about how they forecast.
Yes, and I always like a word function. So here you go. Econo speak. Trump is injecting, quote, structural breaks and non-linearity into forecasting. So there you go.
Squiggly
if you're an economist
lines.
out there,
Lots
you
of
know
squiggly
what
lines.
means.
That's what we've understood from that.
Yeah.
Well, let's turn back to our top story now. And on the eve of the G20, the US has decided to authorise Ukraine to use long-range missile strikes on Russian territory. It comes as there's a sudden clamour for a settlement between Russia and Ukraine ahead of Trump's return and the possibility of drastic cuts in US support. We've got our correspondent Oliver Crook in Berlin with the latest on this story this morning. Oliver, good morning. This is a major decision by President Biden. What's changed and what does it mean for the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, when you talk to Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, about kind of what are the things that would make the greatest difference for the war effort, as we often ask him when we see him in Brussels and the various events where he's circulating, it's all about basically getting the deliveries of weapons and also lifting the restrictions, taking that sort of untying his hands and what he can do with the weapons that are being delivered to him, predominantly by the United States, but also by the rest of Europe. And this is a major shift for the U.S. administration, and again, comes at a time with great uncertainty for the future of Ukraine and what the U.S. policy is going to be under President Trump. But the other issue that you have is, despite the fact that there has been this permissioning of using these, then we should say this is not a blanket permission to strike anywhere in Russia. This is targeted. But there's also the issue of deliveries. He's not getting all of the weapons that he needs, so maybe he doesn't have also all the firepower. But it will make a difference in his efforts in the Kursk region, where we understand now Ukraine is engaging with North Korean troops, and we understand that the fact that there are North Korean troops within Russia and operating is really why this sort of changed the opinion of Biden and the Biden administration. We also can't lose sight of the fact that Biden is currently in legacy mode and is trying to rush through more support for Ukraine ahead of Trump. And it's also significant because there are a lot of other countries that have been supportive to Ukraine, like Germany, for example, that are very reticent to take the first step in terms of sort of crossing red lines. But once the U.S. does, they're very often happy to follow, and that is potentially what is going to happen here.
OK. Ukraine's allies, though, meanwhile, have been pushing for a negotiated peace, and that includes the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz.
Yeah, it's sort of a remarkable news story that we broke on Friday that Olaf Scholz was going to speak with Putin for the first time in 2 years. And as far as we can tell, really the only G7 leader to have spoken to Putin really any time recently. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of trying to interpret kind of what this is. This was an hour-long conversation. We gather also from people that were familiar with the conversation afterwards that they're going to stay in contact afterwards. But there's, of course, a split opinion in a number of places. Of course, Volodymyr Zelensky says that this opens, Pandora's box. But there hasn't been that much criticism from some of the other G7 leaders who we are told Schultz sort of gave the heads up that he was going to have this call with Putin. But it's very odd to think of why is Schultz the right person to have this conversation right now. Schultz himself is in a very weak position. Maybe they just need somebody to take the temperature from Vladimir Putin going into what is an unknown for the future of the war. But also it serves Schultz in a certain way because he says on the campaign trail he is the Chancellor for peace, and that maybe this is a sort of way to sort of demonstrate that. But there is a total inconsistency with this and the stated policy from all the Europeans that is nothing will be decided about Ukraine without Ukraine. But it does speak to a broader question. Do the Europeans now need to start to re-engage with Putin if you get a President Trump who then just takes it out of their hands? Do they really not want to be in that conversation at all?
At the same time, last September, Vladimir Putin described a decision to allow long-range missiles to be used to target inside Russia as tantamount to an act of war. So if we're thinking about, more leaders engaging with Russia, I mean, what is the Kremlin's position now, given this change in position from the US?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to ascertain what the sort of real red lines are. And I think that has been the big struggle for many of these Western leaders, going into this conflict. And everyone has these imagined ideas of what Putin's red lines are. Putin says many things, and there's been a long debate on it. But when I've spoken to some of the sort of leaders and been at the conferences recently, I mean, I asked them, does Europe have any red lines? Is it not potentially the fact that you have soldiers, from a different sovereign nation active in a war in Europe? Does that not cross a red line? And I think that sort of thinking, I mean, the leaders like to sort of talk it down. They say, no, this is not a material escalation. But it seems that this has in some ways changed their thinking materially to a point where they're willing to take that risk with Vladimir Putin.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.